You know, Elder Dragons in a series like Monster Hunter came off substantially less animalistic as most monsters tend to come off. And I know that's by design. They're specifically meant to be a classification of monsters that stands above the rest. They have more presence, a lot more weight, and even a certain air of divinity about them. They stand above most other monsters, twisting the environment and the world to their whims and needs. Some of them do it intentionally, and others do it accidentally, but ultimately they still drastically end up impacting the ecosystem more so than any other creature in the entirety of it. Now, there are other monsters of lesser calibers, air quotes, that can equally do something that's devastating, right? You have Gormagala, which I know is a demi-elder, but he still exists, technically outside of the category of it. And then you have the Quirio on their own, and you also have your Savage Devil Joes. Now, this contrast is something that I enjoy a lot, right? Because you have your standard wyverns, right? Flying wyverns, you have your Rathalos, you have your Rathian, your Brachydios, you have your Legiricris, you have your Plesioth. You have monsters that are a lot more animalistic that exist within the fundamental bounds of reality to a certain degree, right? Sure, they're still fantasy creatures ultimately, but they feel like they're plausible. And that's when you start to leave that territory when you step into Elder Dragons. You know, sure, Teostra releases alchemical compounds in its scales and its ability to breathe fire, thus creating explosions. That's unrealistic, but within the context of Monster Hunter, it's still relatively feasible. There's no universe where I expect anything like a Kushala Daora or Teostra to show up, but within the confines of Monster Hunter, they make it believable. They manage to take fantasy and realism and blend them together, which I think is really, really interesting, and I always will respect Elder Dragons for what they are. Now, I say all of this to lead into the fact that, well, Wilds doesn't have any. Now, with the advent of the Summer Games Fest and the State of Play being right around the corner, I wanted to put out one last video on my hopes and dreams for the Monster Hunter DLC. I know I just made a video earlier, 2 weeks ago to be exact, on this exact same topic. No, I didn't. That video was on the monsters that I hope to see. This is more so about the features, and while sure I could have combined the two into one video, I had completely forgotten about Elder Dragons and my hopes and dreams for them. Sue me, alright? I got excited about talking about my favorite monsters again, so it slipped my mind. And I know earlier I said there aren't really any Elder Dragons in the game, which, if you've played the game at all, you know that's a lie, because Gogmazios exists, right? Now, when Gogmazios finally got added, it was a spectacle. It was a scripted spectacle, but it was still a spectacle nonetheless, right? The presence and the weight that he had was perfect for what he represented, and I have a feeling that based on that, that's the goal that Capcom is trying to go for in regards to how they treat the Elder Dragons going forward. Now, I feel like the lack of Elders is being shown for a reason, right? Given the fact that Zoshia is, for all intents and purposes, a representation of the equal dragon weapon, right? That's not 100% confirmed fact, that's just what I'm assuming based on the showcases that I've seen of him and what it can do and the way that it's meant to be represented within the story, being a weapon of mankind, right? I understand that based on what I remember about the lore, it's essentially the equal dragon weapon was created to combat and essentially destroy significant amounts of elder dragons to give humanity full control over the ecosystem, which led into fatality. There's a lot of other things going in there, but I feel that the reason why there's a lack of elder dragons is because of the guardian weapons. Wyveria and its hubris destroyed a significant amount of the elder dragons that are around there to harvest their parts and study their abilities to help them build more guardian monsters that they can control. Now, I say a lot of this because the way that the inclemencies function reminds me of how each elder dragon would typically change how the ecosystem and the weather itself reacts to them being there. Like when the sand tide hits the windward plains, right? And the lightning would rain down from the sky. It reminded me very much of Kirin, how they have these poles going throughout the entirety of the windward plains that attract the electricity, and how the wind tears the place up. I think that reminds me of both Kushala and Kirin. And then we cut to the Scarlet Forest with the downpour. While they use it, the ancient Wyverns essentially used it to flush out the toxins from all their work in other areas. It reminded me a lot of Namiel, right? of how it would influence the rains and everything that was going on. And the fire spring in the oil well basins reminded me of how Teoster would cause the Wildspire waste to heat up and essentially create a heat storm, and the way Volcana would increase the blizzards and the frost storms going on in the Ice Shard Cliffs. And I don't think that's like an unintentional thing. I don't feel like that's a coincidence. I feel like Capcom deliberately left out the Elder Dragons because they plan on reintroducing them later on in the story for a substantial payoff. Now, I've been saying this for a while, ever since Monster Hunter Wilds came out, but I feel like this is what Monster Hunter was always trying to be, right? The ecology, the story, the characters, the world, everything. I feel like all of it was being built upon each game before it, leading up to this, right? And I'm essentially saying all of this for the Elder Dragons with Gogmazias as the base. And I understand that there's a high likelihood that Gog is an exception to being this idol of what elders are supposed to be. I understand that it's a likelihood that he's being treated this specially because he is fundamentally the end game boss. Like, Gogmazias is the end of base Wilds, and it's supposed to be a bridge leading into the DLC. So I can understand that this might not be the standard that they're gonna go forward with treating every single Elder Dragon, but I hope it is. Now, I say that mostly because of the fact that, well, if that is the case, that means there's a lot more to look forward to, especially with the Elders and more so with Guardian monsters, because I feel like they're underutilized as they are right now, and I feel that that might be intentional, so that Capcom has more room to develop them and do more with them in the DLC. Who knows, we might get Guardian Elders, because if Wyveria could make what's essentially Guardian Fatalis with Zoshia, them creating Guardian Elders doesn't seem that ridiculous to me. But hey, that's just my thoughts on it. We'll see during the State of Play whether the Summer Games Fest or whichever event that they choose to reveal it on. But if I'm right about any of this, you have to come back and subscribe. So I'll catch y'all later. Peace. We could also come back and talk about how the Hunter's probably a Wilk super soldier, but that's not here or there.